Good afternoon, everybody. And good afternoon to those of you online. It's nice to see we have quite a few people online. My name is Susan Painter, and I am the St. Andrew's Vestry Liaison for Adult Formation Commission. And we on the commission are just so pleased that one of our own group leaders, Dr. Vin Clark, is going to share with us today, help us understand this crisis in Ukraine and understand the background that led to it. Those who have participated in Vin's book discussion group, A Christian Journey, have come to really appreciate his knowledge of history and his insight. Vin is a professor of history at Johnson County Community College and was, in fact, the first chairman of the history department there. He has a PhD in modern European history with an additional specialization of the history of religion. So very apt to talk with us today. He was awarded two, not one, but two of the prestigious Fulbright graduate fellowships to the University of Heidelberg, which is one of the oldest universities in the world and the oldest university in Germany. He has published articles and book reviews in both English and German. Vin's window on the world is pretty wide. Both of his parents grew up in East Asia, the children of missionaries. And perhaps, well, definitely more relevant to the topic today, many of you know Vin's lovely wife, Margaret. All four of Margaret's grandparents were Ukrainian. There's a lot more I could say about Vin's background and expertise and the honors he's earned, but I know we're anxious to hear what he has to share with us, and I want to leave plenty of time for your questions. So please join me in welcoming Vin Clark.
Before I begin, I want to say that there are two things that need to be said about any discussion of ethnicities in Europe. And that is that before about 1800, there was no notion that every ethnic group should have its own country, its own political unit. And so as you're going to see today, things were, in our terms, pretty mixed together. But that doesn't have very much bearing on what we're looking at today, where we have nation states that claim to represent all the people in them. And in this particular case, of course, we have one large one that is trying to conquer a small one. I need to say one other thing about that, and that is that this is not directed against the Russian people. The Russian people have suffered perhaps more than any other in the long and sordid history of tyranny in the world. And at the last count, about 5,000 had been arrested for protesting the war and sent to either prison or sent home. In Russia today, it can be a capital offense to be arrested for demonstrating twice. So many people, of course, as you can imagine, have demonstrated once. In addition to that, many Russian immigrants to the United States are thoroughly against the current war. So I think it's important for us to keep that in mind, that we're talking about nations here in some cases, and not about peoples. But nonetheless, we need to talk about that. So let me begin by telling you a little about, we're going to go way back, and as soon as I figure this out, we're going to go back to the 800s, because that's where the sort of demarcation between Ukrainians and Russians and other people in Europe began. And it's where Putin, for example, bases his claim that the Ukrainians and the Russians are one people, and then jumps to the conclusion that he should therefore rule them all. In the 800s, as you can see, things were a little bit disorganized, if you would like to think that in terms of what's going on. So up here is the Baltic Sea, and Sweden. Sweden and Norway at that time were mostly the remains of Viking states. The Vikings had also come down into what is this pink area that you can see here. They were usually referred to as the Varangians, and there are a number of important rivers which facilitated their moving of ships down there. And one of the places that they identified as an important center is the city of Kiev, which is located right here. And as you can see, it's on the Dnieper River, which flows from way up here all the way down here and into the Black Sea. The Varangian, probably, we don't know for sure, but the person who is responsible for establishing the first state was a guy named Vladimir. And here is a picture of him, obviously a photograph. A relatively tough guy who formed what was called the Rus state at what became Kiev. And he was important because he established some of the institutions that people of Eastern Europe maintain to this day. And secondly, he was looked upon as the father of at least two countries, the two countries being Ukraine and Russia. He built a capital at Kiev. It was probably pretty primitive, but it was all they had. He also established the Orthodox Church in Eastern Europe, and there are many stories about how he did this. He was a pagan himself. His aunt, Oleg, was a Christian, but he decided that his people needed to have a more established religion. And so the story is that he traveled around, he went to see the Muslims and the Jews, and finally he went to Constantinople in Greece, where he saw something that was so magnificent that he was immediately taken by that, and that was seeing the liturgy celebrated in the Greek Orthodox Church. And he thought that was so good that he went back and forcibly baptized everybody that he could get his hands on. So the Orthodox Church has a long history in that region, and I wanted to show you a couple of pictures of Orthodoxy in its various forms. And so this is a Greek Orthodox church. I tried to find one of the one that he visited in Constantinople, but it of course has it's reverted to being a mosque. For a long time it was a museum, and it's now a mosque, and so it doesn't look anything like it would have under Vladimir. And by way of sort of a movement, this is the Ukrainian Church of the Transfiguration in Lviv. And I might also mention that in the United States and Canada, many Ukrainian Orthodox, and I'll explain the divisions here, have copied this particular church. And just on a personal note, the Ukrainian Catholic Church, which is really not Roman Catholic, but somewhere in between, in Chicago, in Ukrainian village where my wife was baptized, is a copy of this church in Lviv, although not nearly as fancy. But at any rate, so Byzantine Christianity becomes thoroughly established among both the Russians later on, Ukrainians, and also almost all the Eastern Europeans, Romanians, Bulgarians, and so forth. And it's partly due to the rather forceful missionary activities of Vladimir that that has taken place. I'll talk a little more about how religions have differed and diverted from each other, at least among Ukrainians. Unfortunately for Vladimir, shortly after his death, Mongol warriors completely destroyed the state. And I have a little map that shows the extent of the Mongol conquests. The Mongols were people who were basically sheep or cattle herders who lived in the steppes, that is, the plains of Central Asia. So in this area here, this is China over here. So, but for many hundreds of years, they began extending their power by conquering countries both in East Asia, here, and also all the way into Europe. And you can see where Kiev is right here. They actually got to the gates of Vienna, Austria, which would be about here, before they were finally defeated. So for about 200 years, they basically had their sway. They were not very nice people. That is, that they were given to raids on villages and attacks on people who had no defenses. And so there's sort of chaos that goes on. They were great horseback warriors, as you can see in this, once again, photographic rendering. So we have about 200 years of the Mongols and no state, real state, existing in much of Central and Eastern Europe. Then at the end of this period, a Russian prince, he was not yet a czar or anything like that, he was just a guy that managed to boss people around, who called himself Ivan III, overthrew the Mongols and established control of all the noblemen in the region. Noblemen were people who basically controlled land, they owned land, they had their own private armies. We might think of them as, in many ways, sort of like mafia chieftains. And if you didn't like it, too bad. They knew little things that they could do to you, and sometimes they would work with each other and sometimes not. And in the case of Ivan III, he managed to get control, or at least the acquiescence, of the local noblemen in Moscow. Now I need to show you a picture of, I think I have the map here, just a second, to show you, I guess not, but I want to show you how far Moscow is from Kiev, where the origin of this civilization took place. It is, and I looked this up on Google to find out how far it was to drive. And by the way, the road must be just terrible, because the total distance is from Moscow to Kiev is 535 miles. And according to Google, that's at least 9 hours. So you can tell that road conditions are not that great. And that was before the war, of course. Google's now discontinued its map service in Russia. You'll be surprised to hear that. They were reporting on traffic jams and things like that, but that's all gone now. So at any rate, it's a long ways away, and I'm sorry I don't have that map that shows that, but so when we talk about Moscow becoming the center of Russia, we're talking about something that's almost 600 miles from the original center, which is Kiev. And conditions farther east like this made this sort of power these sorts of power grabs possible. Then under his descendant Ivan IV, who was also aptly known as Ivan the Terrible, and we won't go into some of his exploits, the Grand Duchy of Moscow then became the Tsardom of Russia. Now, this is a pretty big jump in what the Tsars thought of themselves, because, as you can see here, Tsar in Russian means Caesar. So these people imagine themselves not as a bunch of sort of thugs living on the outskirts of civilization, but as the descendants of the Roman emperors. Now, some of the Roman emperors were thugs too. I don't want to exalt that too much, but we have this sort of glorification of Moscow and of the government of Moscow that actually begins in this period of about 1547. And it also means that Russian power, now called Russian power, is centralized in Moscow, not Kyiv, not 500 miles away. And if you think of transportation at the time, which is horses on bad roads, you know that it's not easy to exercise power 500 miles away from where your capital is. It's a little easier with cars, but we're seeing that even that has some problems as well. But at any rate, this is a long ways away from Kyiv. The Tsars gradually established centralized power over parts of Russia, and it's expanded over the period of 500 years to get more and more powerful, but always from the power central of Moscow. The other thing about the Tsars is that the peasants, the ordinary people who lived in villages and grew a few crops, were increasingly forced into serfdom. Now, this is a process that's taking place all through Eastern Europe, in what is today Eastern Germany, Poland, most of the Austrian Empire, Hungary, Russia, and so forth. And serfdom means simply that people are required to live on the land, and they cannot leave without their owner's permission, often written, assuming, of course, that the owner could write, which was not always the case. And if they left without permission, they could be subject to all kinds of penalties, including the death penalty. The idea was, the reason that this was done was that it was hard to get labor, and so you didn't want a lot of people roaming around, and therefore you make a law that everybody has to stay put. And serfdom is extended in this period from about the 1500s on, all through Eastern Europe. In Western Europe, the Black Death had wiped out so many peasants that people were desperate, landlords were desperate to have any kind of labor they could get, and they had to forget about serfdom. But in Eastern Europe, where there was a lot less concentration of population, the lords, the nobility, the aristocracy, were able to increasingly force the peasants into serfdom. And eventually in Russia, it becomes probably the worst in the world. Russian law provided, for example, that if a serf had a complaint against the lord, who was, by the way, the judge at the same time, say for rape of peasant women, which was very common, that the complainant was subject to the death penalty. And this lasted until the abolition of serfdom in Russia in 1871. So we're looking at a system that is extremely repressive. And the estimates are that 90 to 95% of all Russian people at the time that serfdom was abolished were actually serfs. So when we think of the Russian people, we have to remember that they have hundreds of years of the experience of a terrible tyranny that we can hardly even imagine. And when they finally emerged from serfdom in 1871, there's a very brief period, and then the Bolsheviks, as we'll discuss, take over again, and they're again subject to horrible repression, and that lasts up until 1991, when there's a 10-year period in which they're sort of free, and then we have Putin again. I said again because this idea of having a ruler who has power over everybody and exercises it to prevent people from even speaking is an old Russian malady that has been renewed by Putin himself. So at any rate, that's what's happening in Russia, and it's not good, of course. Let me go on here a little bit. Now, Ukrainians, contrary to Putin, did not live in Russia predominantly. They lived in what was called the Polish-Lithuanian Empire, and this yellow area that you see here is an example of that. So just to give you an idea, this is Kiev. This is a Polish map, so you can't, unless you read Polish, you can't read it, but it's, this is Kiev. And remember where it was ordinarily, so Moscow is way up here somewhere. This is a very interesting empire because it was based on a marriage between a Lithuanian nobleman and a queen of Poland, and then eventually you had a single monarch. And amazingly enough, they had a constitution, the first written constitution, the first one in Europe, I think the first one in the world. They had about 20% of the people were noblemen. They were all represented in a parliament. There was religious freedom that eventually disappeared but existed at that time. And the other thing is that this was a multi-ethnic empire that lasted until the 1790s. And so within this empire, you of course had Poles, Lithuanians, Ukrainians, Germans, a lot of different people all sort of getting along together. They didn't, of course, as I mentioned, have their own country, but nobody had thought of that yet. But they're living in a fairly liberal, in the broadest sense of the term, empire. And this lasts, as I said, from approximately 1500 to about 1800, so 300 years. And that's where most Ukrainians lived. So anyway, I'll just hold this up here for you to think about. This is part of the empire. This is the other part. And now we're talking about Poland proper itself. This is Krakow, for example. This is Breslau now in Germany. Gdansk, which has gone back and forth and so forth. So this is a huge empire. And of course, hardly anybody knows about it except the Poles, I suppose, and the Lithuanians. But at any rate, that's where Ukrainians lived. So any claim that Russia and Ukraine were living, Russians and Ukrainians were living together, is pretty hard to maintain. This is Russia, or what it exists. At that time, the population was not very strong, especially down here in the south, where you had people who were called Cossacks, who basically were like wild nomads who would occasionally fight for one side or another in various local conflicts. So anyway, that's where Ukrainians were. Put this back around my ear again. There we go. So I've indicated some of the main things that happened. This empire was strong enough so that they could attack Russia, and they did actually attack Russia and defeat Russia in 1605 to 18. It's during this time that the Ukrainian bishops, who were nominally under the Patriarch of Moscow, decided they'd had enough of being pushed around. And so they looked around for another connection, and the connection they found was with the Pope. And so what we have is, First, we have the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and now we have a new body, which is called Uniate, but most Ukrainians refer to it as the Greek Catholic Church, and it has loyalty to the Pope, but all of the old usages of the Byzantine Empire. So the churches look the same as they did in Byzantine times. The priests can marry, and almost always do. And so the Greek Catholic Church is, I don't know if it's dominant but it's an important body. If you go to the Ukrainian village in Chicago, anybody ever been there? Yeah, it's used to be a working class area, and not anymore. Now it's been thoroughly gentrified, but there are 3 Ukrainian churches in a row. There's a Greek Catholic cathedral, there is a Orthodox church, and there's a Roman Catholic church right beside each other. So, you know, you could take your pick. But this is an important development. And while I'm talking about this, I think I want to back up here to talk a little about the worship space and the liturgy that existed in both Byzantine churches and also the Greek Catholic churches. So have any of you been to an Orthodox church? Some people here. Usually the Greek Orthodox churches in both Overland Park and South Kansas City have extremely good Greek food festivals that are, I strongly recommended. And you can take a little tour of the church. One of the customs that developed was the idea that the Eucharist, the actual consecration of the Eucharist, was so holy that ordinary people couldn't see it. So instead what they built was a wall along here, and in this case you can see it only goes this high. This is the door that goes to it, and then there are icons all along here. This is the iconostasis. And you'll notice here the Church of the Transfiguration and Leave has the same arrangement. No organs, because organ music was viewed as not holy enough for God. But lots and lots of icons. There was an argument in the early church in the 500s and 600s about whether or not you could portray divine figures legally. And the Eastern churches decided pretty much that if they were flat, that was okay, icons in other words. But statues, right over the edge. So let me get back here. This is where we were. Okay, so I'm going to skip rapidly over this because I discovered when I put it on the screen that it's absolutely unintelligible. So this is the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth or Empire at its greatest extent, and this roughly shows where each ethnic group lived. And if you've been following the news, you know that the country of Ukraine today extends out to this green line here, and also included this peninsula called Crimea, and a city called Sebastopol, and all of these cities now are being under heavy bombardment. The current Russian government simply took over Crimea 10 years ago and holds that. But at any rate, you can see the extent of where Ukrainian people lived. These are the White Russians, known as the Belarusians. Here's a much bigger version of Lithuania than we have now in Latvia and also Estonia, and I think Poland's about the same size, but that gives you some idea of where the sort of long-standing homelands of each of these people was. Meanwhile, back in Russia, and I'm sort of bouncing back and forth here, the Tsars in the 1700s were busily tightening restrictions on most people. You'd think that would be impossible, but they had figured out ways of doing it. So they began requiring the boyars, who were the nobility, to work for the state. So they could no longer live on their estates and torture their peasants, but they were required to go to Moscow and either be officers in the army or bureaucrats or something like that. It is usually thought that they were very inefficient, and the Russian army has a very bad record of inefficiency, which we hope continues. You may know that there is a column of armored vehicles 30 miles long within a few miles of Kyiv. And American intelligence has indicated that the reason that it's just sitting there is because they've run out of fuel and food. In the First World War, to give you an example, when Russia attacked Germany, the Russian army had millions and millions of soldiers, but they didn't have enough guns, enough rifles. And so typically what they did was a soldier would say, "Where's my rifle?" I'd say, "You see this guy right over here? Wait till he gets killed, then you'll get his." And the result of that, of course, in the First World War and also in the Crimean War, a previous thing, was terrible Russian casualties. These poor little young guys just slaughtered as they came up against armies that were better organized. We don't know if that's still the case or not. But at any rate, in this period, and we're talking now about the 18th century, the restrictions were tightened on almost everybody. Almost all peasants were restricted to serfdom. Some had previously been able to get away if they lived on sort of the edge of a settled area. And I have a picture here of peasants about the year 1800. They're dressed up in their best clothes, and you can see that they live in squalor. This is the main street, mud, terrible houses, and tremendous death rates and so forth.
Were streets in good parts of the city paved?
It depended. Sometimes in Moscow there would be ceremonial streets that would be paved, but there would often be streets that were not paved at all. There's a wonderful book about mud, which is a history of Russia, because in the springtime, when the snow melts and it begins to rain, the whole country in traditional times, and this may have been alleviated somewhat recently, is reduced to mud. Nothing can move, which means, of course, the Russian army can't move. But at any rate, that's a good question, but that has been a standard problem with Russia. The Russians began building railroads in the period about 1870 and on. They brought in French companies to build the railroads. How well the railroads work, I don't know. Merchants also were restricted to certain locations, so if you had a store and you were somewhere, you couldn't open another branch. This was considered very dangerous because then you might have ideas about overthrowing the government, perhaps. And in the 18th century, the 1700s, there were many large peasant revolts, thousands of people, and they were savagely suppressed. So that's sort of what's going on in Russia. A very restrictive, repressive government headed by the Tsars from 1630 on, the Romanov family, who ruled until 1917. During the 1700s, there were a number of powerful Tsars that made the central government even more powerful. One of them was Peter the Great. Peter the Great announced that he no longer was satisfied simply to have a country. He wanted to have an empire. And so he conducted a series of wars in which he conquered countries like Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, so that he was able to have a frontage on the Baltic Sea. He also built a city which he named after himself, called St. Petersburg, and brought in Italian architects to design the buildings, of course, and coerced the peasants to build it for him. Another important and powerful Tsar was Catherine the Great. Almost everybody's heard of her because she's the subject of fairly lurid movies that are presented from time to time. She was a minor German princess who married the Tsar and immediately decided that she didn't like that arrangement at all and connived at his murder, plus the murders of several other important and powerful people, and then named herself the Empress of Russia. She considered herself to be enlightened. She would write in French, which was the language of all educated people, to people like Voltaire in France, and they would discuss plans for making the world better. And at the same time, she was making the peasants' condition worse. There was a major peasant revolt under her, which was put down pretty savagely. She also joined other countries, and I'll name them in a minute, in attacking and splitting up the Polish Empire. So from the late 1700s to 1795, I think, there were 3 countries that were involved in splitting up this empire among themselves. And the other thing I might mention is that she brought in the people called the Volga Germans. Is anybody descended from the Volga Germans here? Yes. So the Volga Germans were brought in because Catherine couldn't get enough workers, the peasants being repressed, and they were given special privileges, such as being exempt from the draft and from most taxes. By the way, I might mention how the draft was conducted. That was not like a selective service system, because nobody kept records. What they would do is they would have recruiting units of the army, soldiers, who would be sent to villages. And as soon as they would see a young man who looked like he might be a good soldier, they would grab him. And he would then be in the army for 10 years. That was the minimum length of time. And as you can imagine, when villagers heard that these guys were coming, everybody hid. But that's how the Russian army was constructed. Of course, noblemen were all the officers. These were people who were also the people who owned serfs, plus people who had been conscripted by this sort of forcible way. I'll talk a little about the Volga Germans in a minute, but for the time being, they had a better deal than anybody else in Russia. I mentioned that 3 empires decided that they were going to take parts of Poland. And the 3 empires were Russia and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was composed of a German-speaking Austria plus Hungarians who spoke Hungarian but probably also German, and then the German state of Prussia. And so these are the 3 partitions of Poland, and you can see that this color is Russian. This color is Austrian, so becomes the Austrian Empire, and the blue is Prussian. I think their uniforms are blue too. And so they grabbed all of this. Now remember, Peter the Great has already grabbed this stuff at the top. You see Riga there, that's in Estonia, and Dorpat, which is in Lithuania, and so forth. And that's given him access to the Black Sea, except when there's a lot of ice on the Baltic Sea. So Poland, as an empire, now ceases to exist by 1792 because it's been partitioned. And so Ukrainians, remember, are living in this area here and all through here, and they're split up among these various powers. My wife's family had the good fortune of being in the part of Poland that had been taken over by the Austrians, and that is in this little area right up in here, which is called in German Galician or Galicia. And the advantage of that, if there was an advantage, was that the Emperor of the Austrians, Joseph II, believed that he was enlightened like Catherine the Great, but he actually followed through on it, partly because he was afraid of a revolution, and freed all the serfs in 1648, and then gave them even more privileges in 1668. Also, it's interesting that since a lot of Ukrainians came to this country from this area, they were considered by the governments of Canada, at least, to be Austrians. And in the Second World War, the First World War, Austria, as you remember, and Germany fought against Britain. The Canadians were part of the British Empire. And so the Archbishop of, the Ukrainian Archbishop made a very foolish statement in which he said, good Austrians should fight for Austria. Canadian government's response to that was to simply start rounding up Ukrainians. But at any rate, that's sort of the deal. So at any rate, that's what happens to Ukrainians. They become absorbed into these empires, these various empires. And if you look at the map, you might, this is a map, once again a map in Polish, so it's a little hard to tell what's going on. But here we have Lviv, once again, right here, it's now slipped into Russian hands. So let me move along here. So I have the abolition of serfdom, but serfdom has sort of disappeared. I guess it's been abolished here. This is a picture of Joseph II and the Austrian Empire. And then in Russia, a miracle happened. I don't know whether it was a result of prayer or not, but at any rate, a miracle happened. And Alexander II, the Tsar, decided to free the serfs, and he freed them all in the year 1861. Unlike the United States, where freeing the slaves took about 700,000 casualties, the Tsar of Russia could just click his finger and that was it. At the same time, by the way, he was sort of centralizing and modernizing the state. And what that meant was bad news for the Volga Germans, because they had been exempt from the draft, and now he wants a draft that covers every young man, and they had been exempt from certain taxes, and he's not interested in that. And so beginning in the 1860s, the Volga Germans began looking for a new place to live, and one of the places is the American Midwest. So that's what's going on. I'm going to skip ahead here. So we got to 1860 and 1870, and then there's a brief period in which there's an attempt made to modernize Russia. The serfs are free. At a certain point, they give them the right to sell their own land. There's a revolution in 1905, which results in a parliament. And then, of course, the First World War comes along, caused mostly by Russia, and it's a catastrophe. I'll tell you briefly what they did. The Serbians, who are a Slavic people, they speak a Slavic language. Half of Serbia was in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which had lots and lots of different ethnic groups. Half of it was an independent state. Serbian government came up with this crack-brained plan to assassinate Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who was the heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary, when he visited a city in his own country, which was Sebastopol. Not Sebastopol, but at any rate. And so they did. The Austrians immediately suspected what had happened, that the Serbian government was involved in this, as they were, and refused to allow the Austrian police to investigate. The Austrians then gave the Serbians an ultimatum. The Russians said that if the Austrians attacked Serbia, they would attack, as other Slavs, they would attack Austria. When the Austrians actually entered Serbia, the Russian government found that it had no plan, no war plans that would enable it to attack Austria. The only thing they had were war plans that allowed it to attack Germany. so they attacked Germany. That produced the Second World War. So at any rate, at the end of this, by 1917, things were terrible in Russia. The Germans had conquered hundreds of miles of square territory. Millions of Russian soldiers had deserted. People were running out of food. There were two revolutions. One was a revolution demanding that the Tsar, who pretended to be the father of his country, they demanded that he give them bread. He sent out the army to shoot the demonstrators. And then the next day he abdicated, and he wrote in his diary, "Nothing important happened today." And then there's a long period in which Parliament tries to run the country, and finally the Bolsheviks seize power in a second revolution in 1917. When this happens, the various other ethnic groups, non-Russian ethnic groups, decide that this would be a time for them to seek their own independence. So there were several attempts at creating an independent but communist, socialist Ukrainian state. And by 1922, the main Russian Bolsheviks had subsumed by force all of these sort of ethnic countries into the Soviet Union. And to sort of hide this, they called it the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, as though these were all independent republics. But of course, it's all run from Moscow. So all the ethnic groups were forced into the Soviet Union, and this does not bode well, as you can imagine. In 1930, Stalin decided that peasants, small farmers, a general definition of a peasant is somebody who farms less than 5 acres, were a big problem. He thought that they might revolt against the Soviet government, and he wanted just to get control of it. And so what he decided to do was to collectivize it. That is, to force all private agricultural workers into what are called collective farms, which essentially were managed by somebody, usually from the party, and everybody was an agricultural laborer. This was a disaster, an agricultural catastrophe, because hardly any crops were planted in 1930 and 1931, and there was no harvest. So millions of people were on the verge of starvation, and Stalin saw this as a great chance to get rid of the Ukrainians, because he thought the Ukrainians might harbor some desire for independence. So his solution was simply to send the Red Army, the Russian army, in and block all of the roads into and out of Ukrainian areas so that no food could be brought in. And this is the result. In Ukrainian, this is called the Holodomor. About 4 million people were starved to death. And here are some pictures of people who are on the verge of death. This information was made available in the United States, but there was unfortunately the chief correspondent for the New York Times, who was a man named Durante, who went to Ukrainian areas and reported that everything was fine. And for this brilliant reporting, he received the Pulitzer Prize. So at any rate, you have the Holodomor, in which about 4 million people are killed. And that, of course, there is no revolt against Stalin among Ukrainians after that. There are lots more horrible pictures like this, but they're all about the same. We're going to skip ahead again to 1989. In 1989, Mikhail Gorbachev was the Soviet prime minister and head of the Communist Party, and he decided the Soviet Union was unable to keep up with the West. And so he allowed all of the subsidiary states, East Germany, Hungary, Romania, and so forth, to leave the Warsaw Pact and leave the control of Russia. And he also came to the conclusion, or he was sort of forced to the conclusion, that there was not much enthusiasm in Russia itself for the Soviet Union. And so in 1991, the Soviet Union officially collapsed, ceased to exist, and it was replaced by something called the Russian Republic. At that time, elections were held, and as I said, there were about 9 years of reasonably open democratic government. And then in 2000, of course, Vladimir Putin was elected and began systematically making himself more powerful. When Ukraine left the Soviet Union, they did so by a vote of 70% of the people. They also agreed to give up their nuclear weapons, and Russia agreed to protect their borders. And so here we have Putin. He takes over Russia, and he changed the constitution so that he could be elected forever. He savagely stamped out opposition. Today there's no opposition at all. It's completely illegal because the war, of course, made it impossible to allow people to say, we don't like this. He says that the Soviet Union, when it ended, was one of the greatest tragedies in the history of the world, and he says, presumably, he's going to try to put it back together again. And then he began attacking Ukraine. First, he imposed a prime minister on the country that the people revolted against, and in a series of demonstrations forced to leave. He then, 10 years ago, seized Crimea from Ukraine in defiance of international law, and now he has invaded Ukraine itself. So that's the story, folks. Not pretty, and there are a lot of details that I had to leave out because I didn't have, obviously, time to deal with them. Are there any questions? Yes?
So, as a modern historian, we've currently got NATO is not really certain if it wants to get involved. Well, it can't get involved because of the Joint Defense Clause, and that breaks the NATO treaty. But how likely do you expect? Because Putin is kind of unstable right now, mentally,
Yes.
more so than usual. How likely do you think a NATO involvement will escalate to a nuclear war?
Well, I think I don't think NATO is going to be involved because both several NATO countries plus the Soviet Union have nuclear weapons. And I think at least on the NATO side, they would not risk that. NATO has done everything except that. They are sending weapons to Ukraine, especially anti-tank weapons and anti-aircraft weapons. You'll notice that you haven't heard very much about the Russian Air Force. My guess is that they're afraid to fly over Ukraine. They've moved 100 NATO nation planes to Poland. So I don't know. I don't think NATO will be become involved.
I'm not saying that NATO will willingly get involved, but Putin has been talking about, like, if there's no fly zone, and talk about sanctions, and also there have been discussions with NATO about if a Russian cyber attack takes out a Polish hospital, does that activate Article 5?
Probably does.
Yeah.
Then we don't know what will happen. Yes.
Could you speculate with us on the possible resolution of how this might end?
It's hard to know.
I know it's hard to know. I mean, will he occupy and then have a, what do you call it, internal resistance going on for a long period of time?
That's one possibility. I mean, the other possibility that people look at is the Soviet invasion and occupation of Afghanistan, which they finally decided to, which they previously decided to give up because it was just too much trouble. There is no information being given, as far as I know, to Russian families about the fate of their children, their sons who are in the Russian army. the Ukrainians have set up a web page to provide an accounting for these people, which is kind of an amazing development.
300 RF.
Yeah. You'd know the,
Yeah, 300 RF, which is a reference to the old Soviet code, Cargo 300, which referred to basically kill in action soldiers being shipped back to Russia.
right. They're not being shipped back now. They're,
No, there's mobile crematoriums.
yeah,
Their bodies are being burned.
that's right. Yes, sir.
Putin's pictured at a long table with his ministers at the other end. They must be an important inner circle of people at the end of the table.
There is, and
What do you think the likelihood is that
they would overthrow him. The people who are in his inner circle, as I understand it, are all people who have habitually over the years been forced to say yes to whatever he wants at the risk of getting their jobs ended, their families shipped off to Siberia. Exactly. So how independent they'd be, I don't know. That's a really good question. Right. Yes?
As far as one himself, what is the long-term plan? What is he wants to rebuild the Soviet Union, is that?
That's what he says. Whether he means it or not, I don't know, because of course rebuilding the Soviet Union would mean retaking the Baltic republics of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, and they're part of NATO. So whether he really thinks he's going to do that or not, or whether these are bluffs, nobody knows. There is pretty good American intelligence, which is not available to the average person, about what's going on in Putin's inner circle. Yes?
The sanctions on oligarchs in Russia, are those designed to influence Putin?
Absolutely, because, you know, he got rich as the head of state, and other people got rich because they were given powerful industries. And I think Germany has just seized a huge luxury yacht that belongs to one of them. Yes?
This morning I heard there was a foreign legion growing, which was some 14,000 fighters right now, including Americans,
Right.
being led by a former Army officer, U.S.
Uh-huh.
Do you think that's feasible, that it could grow to the point that the Ukrainians could prevail and win this?
Well, if 14,000 is not much of a,
Not
not much against 100,000.
it would grow, though.
It might. I mean, one of the things that's been interesting is Ukrainian men are coming from all over the world to join the fight. I don't think Putin had any notion that people would fight back like that. Yes?
we're seeing Russia decouple basically from the international world finance
Right.
monetary system through the SWIFT banking system, which
Mm-hmm.
they're unplugged from. What do you think the Chinese can do to quietly compensate for some of that?
I don't think they have enough money. I mean, you know, the ruble in one day fell by a third, and the ATMs are all closed because as of, I think today or maybe yesterday, Visa and MasterCard closed all of their operations in Russia. It's hard to know. I mean, you know, I don't know how much money he has and how determined he is.
China's also got to make a decision, which they're probably going to make in about a week and a half after the end of the Paralympic Games, is do we want to become a pariah?
Yeah.
Putin's a pariah now. It's like
Right.
China's economy needs the West more than the West needs China.
Well, there's a story that actually China persuaded Russia to put this invasion off until after the Olympic Games. I think probably economic pressure is a lot more powerful than sports, but you know, Russia's been banned from the World Cup, so I don't think they have much chance of winning anyway. Yes?
If you assume Putin will take Ukraine, and next on his menu is the three little Baltic states.
Right.
Will NATO just pull another 1938 and let him take that?
I don't know, they're part of NATO. They're part of NATO, but I strongly suspect that he will be a lot more cautious about doing that.
NATO is no League of Nations.
That's right. I mean, there's an ironclad treaty, which Putin doesn't like at all, of course. But we don't know. I mean, you know, it may be that Putin will not prevail in Ukraine, or he may prevail only in parts of Ukraine. We just don't know. Yes?
If something happens to Putin, whichever way that might go, what's the succession plan?
There is no succession. It's a scramble for power at that point. It's the usual.
Enlighten us a little bit about how that scramble might go. Seriously, the oligarchs, or
Whoever has it'll be like a fight between the nobles or the mafia. Whoever can get the most power and the most muscle into the situation would take over.
Is there no chance of true democracy, you think?
There's always a chance.
Yeah, possibly, but it's hard to tell. I mean, yes?
And we don't hear much about cyber attack being the atomic bomb.
Yeah, two can play that game.
We could play it, but how?
Well, I think now,
About it's going on already?
well, I think right now the Ukrainians are sort of winning that war. But there are obviously some top secret things that are happening in the United States that are not available to the average person.
Because anonymous is.
So it's impossible to say. As I said, American intelligence has been very good at figuring out what's going on inside the Kremlin and within the Russian army. What its limits are, I don't know. John maybe has some idea. Do you have any ideas on what the limits of American intelligence in the Soviet Union might be? You're off the record here, of course.
I would venture they are quite broad, but beyond that, I wasn't involved in the spy end of things. I was involved in building all the Polish and naval.
The spying to go on, yes, yes. I mean, we don't, if we're lucky, those are kept very, very secret, so we don't know. Yes?
It is interesting that somebody brought up the picture of Putin sitting here and his lieutenants are a half mile away.
Right. I mean, that's the famous 60-foot-long table.
Yeah. Recently, in fact, just this morning, there were several pictures of Putin, and he was literally surrounded by women. Very close.
Right. That might be propaganda too. Yes.
How much of these 150,000, soldiers, how is the communication and fair enough number of them? How much were they in the know of? Are they going to begin a war?
The average soldier knew nothing about this. Captured soldiers have said they had no idea what was going to be involved. But that's the Russian tradition, actually. Some traditions prevail over long periods of time and others don't. And we can only hope that the Russian tradition of military incompetence prevails here. Yes, Adam?
Historically, the main armies fail against Russia. What is the advantage they have?
Well,
Does that play into why NATO doesn't want to take a strong stand?
no, the reason NATO doesn't want to take a strong stand is because the Soviet Union has nuclear weapons. The two major failures were by Napoleon and by Hitler, and those were individual miscalculations, especially Hitler. One of my friends who is a Soviet historian said that the advance of Army Group Mita, the Central Army Group that was supposed to take Moscow, every day they would report to Hitler at his bunker in East Prussia, and tell him where they were. And he'd say, well, there's an interesting little city 50 or 60 kilometers off to the east or west. And so they actually went more than 1,000 miles out of the way. And had they gone straight to Moscow, they might have taken it. Well, that's the thing, because they ran out of weather, and the assumption was, a wise assumption was, don't fool with the Russian winter. So, for example, there were no winter uniforms issued to German troops. There was no motor oil that would work below freezing. They had to start tanks by building fires under them.
As for nuclear, what are, when Putin brings that up, what are his options? What are limited?
What I've heard is that he has over 700 nuclear weapons, individual nuclear weapons, and these are distributed among submarines, which I imagine are being tracked even as we speak, on mobile launchers, and then on some fixed launchers as well. So 700 nuclear weapons, even if only half of them hit their target, are a catastrophe. Probably it would, yes. Right, but I mean, you know, it might be the end of the world. Because the United States would certainly fire back.
NATO would fire back, which would mean, and then eventually you just have an African alliance that pretty much.
Well, they did war games of what a nuclear exchange would look like during the Eisenhower administration. And the assumption was that the United States would unload almost all of its nuclear weapons as quickly as possible.
You mean fire them
Fire
off?
them, yes.
All of them?
A lot of them.
More than Russia does.
Well, we have, I don't know what the current figure is, it's about 800 or something like that. So that's, you know, when Putin talks about, I don't know if he's serious, or I think he would have to be deranged to be seriously talking about nuclear weapons.
What are the odds that whoever would have to do it would refuse and somehow disabled or?
Well, there's actually an incident like that that's reported in the New York Times, that when, a long time ago, when a Korean airliner missed its boundaries and went into Soviet airspace and was then shot down, the order was given to fire nuclear weapons at the United States, and the technician or the officer, whoever it was, refused. And he sent back a message and said, this must be an error.
Is that many more smart people there?
You know, there are lots of smart people in Russia. One of my most brilliant students was a Russian woman, and I hope she's all right, who was running a fairly big company in St. Petersburg. And there are lots of very smart people in Russia. There are people who are not treated very well, but there are lots of smart people. Anything else? Oh, you're welcome. I do have a list of charities that you can send money to. Yeah, I need to do that, don't I? Okay, so here's a list of 4 that have been identified by the Fulbright Association, which is composed of people who've had Fulbright. Can you see that? Which is composed of people who've had Fulbright, so people who care about foreign countries. So, yes, like me.
They're here, aren't they? Doctors Without Borders, are they based here in Kansas?
They are, yes. Uh-huh.
Are those all just?
Oh, no, no, there are lots of other. Oh, you're welcome. Thank you. No, there are lots of good organizations. You know, my thought is that when you give to a charity, and I know you know this, check to see how much of the money actually goes to the recipients and how much goes to administration.